I've got a present for you.
Structure sold.
Real tough guy.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
On hold. Cancel. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Comrade.
Our base is under attack. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Yes,
ready.
sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed.
Unit ready. Building.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Reporting at once. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Comrade. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Vehicle
Building.
reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, affirmative.
Yes, sir. Very well.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Building.
Reporting. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged. Comrade. Affirmative. Comrade. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready. Building.
Affirmative.
Structure sold.
Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Very well.
lost.
At once. At once. Agreed. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Agreed. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed. Agreed. Reporting. Affirmative. Very well. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative.
Our base is under attack.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting. Affirmative.
Yes, affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Comrade.
ready.
Yes, affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, affirmative.
Waiting. Affirmative.
New construction options. Building.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Waiting orders.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building. Building.
Comrade. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Very well. Awaiting orders.
Unit ready. Unable to comply. Building in progress. Construction complete. Building.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
I've got a present for you.
Building.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building. Construction complete. Building.
Comrade.
Our base is under attack.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Comrade. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir.
Construction
Yes, sir.
complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Building.
Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Acknowledged. Reporting.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Comrade.
Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Affirmative.
Unit lost. Objective met. Unit ready.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Comrade.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Comrade. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Awaiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Awaiting.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Waiting order.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Very well.
Construction complete. Construction options.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Comrade, acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Vehicle acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Ready and waiting.
Building. On hold. Cancel. Unable to comply. Building in progress. Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building. On hold. Cancel. Unit ready. Building. Building.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Comrade. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Waiting
Building.
order. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Acknowledged. Awaiting acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Unit
Yes,
ready.
sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Comrade.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting affirmative.
order.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Vehicle acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Comrade. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged. Await. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Building.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
lost.
course. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting. Comrade, acknowledged.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative.
Comrade,
Affirmative.
waiting order.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Comrade. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Vehicle report.
Naval unit lost. Naval unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Acknowledged.
Naval
Comrade.
unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative.
Comrade.
Affirmative. Vehicle report.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Comrade. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Report. Acknowledged.
Unit
Yes,
lost.
sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Affirmative. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Building.
Yes, sir. Very well. Yes, sir. Of course. Of course.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Waiting order.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Comrade.
Acknowledged. Await. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Affirmative.
Waiting order.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Comrade. Acknowledged.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Mission accomplished.